Folly podcast. Today, I am joined by Keith Preston and Tim Patton to discuss the viability of collectivism, or can collectivism work? So one of the things we often see in public discourse between the left and the right is, collectivism can't work. The Soviet Union failed. And the left is like, wow, it's never been tried. Part of the problem is defining what collectivism is. Because on the left, collectivism is kind of a euphemism for everything that's good. So obviously collectivism is good because everything that's happened is the result of collectivism. And everything bad that's happened is basically crypto-reactionary fascism, which is why Trotsky and Stalin were fascists. So, and then on the right, the capitalist liberal right, you have like libertarians and randroids who say that everyone's a collectivist, which is a swear word for anybody that's not a market individualist. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be using this definition of collectivism. I define collectivism for these purposes as the regulation of the individual's economic liberty by the collective for the perceived common good of the whole. Now, that may not be a perfect example, but at least it's precise enough to be useful and not a loaded term like it's everything that's good or it's everything that's bad in the world. Now, what you'll often hear from normie conservatives and libertarians is that collectivism can't work or never has worked. Now, on a very local, small level, it has and can work. To some extent, the family operates on communist principles, right? Children don't eat according to what they can produce. They eat according to their needs. And so in some, like the anarchist anthropologist David Graeber points this out, he's not wrong. Now, the question then is, how viable is that model beyond the family level or even the local communal level? And we all can see communes, hippie communes, medieval peasant communes. So that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about, can you scale this up to a national level? Can you run a nation along collectivist lines? Now, one of the first attempts to theorize about this was Thomas More's Utopia, which in this case, it was a theocracy. And it was basically ordered. It was actually a military dictatorship and a theocracy because the utopians were always at war with their neighbors for more land and more slaves. In this regard, you could argue Thomas More's Utopia is inspired by the Spartans. They have a slave class that serves the citizen class to do all the menial tasks that they don't want to do. Now, given this definition of collectivism, I think collectivism could theoretically and even in practice work at the national level. So, but it could not work as a liberal, egalitarian, humanist system. That's just not possible. Because the first problem with collectivism is that since property is held in common and everybody is remunerated for their services equally, you have a couple problems here. You have the free rider problem of people that just want to consume from the collective without working because they're rewarded equally. And as long as you don't punish those people, and of course liberal progressives won't, then they'll just eat you out of house and home, as we saw with the New Harmony experiment in the 1830s. Or you also have the problem of, since property is held in common, how do you determine who uses it when? If you have private property, then it's like, okay, this guy owns it. This guy can set the rules for how to use it. How do you divvy up who uses the property when? Because property is still a scarce resource. You could theoretically run the collective estate as one giant property holder. Theoretically, you could do that. But then that becomes indistinguishable from Tsarist Russia, which is an arch-reactionary state. So what I would say is the best way to deal with the free rider problem that has actually worked in the past, i.e. people who consume from the collective without doing any work or doing the minimum amount of work necessary. They're not putting in everything needed to keep the system going. Would either be a military dictatorship like Sparta or a theocracy like the Jesuits in Paraguay. So Sparta is a military caste system based on slavery, in a lot of ways like Thomas More's Utopia, where everything's the same. Your house is the same. There's no money. That's another thing. Collectivists want to get rid of money. Well, Sparta had no money for a very long time. So this is a very, viable historical example. And one of the things that makes them, why is a military dictatorship suitable to collectivism? Because of all the modern professions today in the Western world, the military is the most socialist and collectivist by definition. Everybody's the same. Like you come in, you have the same haircut, the same bunk, the same food, the same everything. Any sort of individuality is beaten out of you. And if you have a conscript force, like say during World War II, you could be the son of the 1%. Like say George Herbert Walker Bush. He was from money. Same as John F. Kennedy. He was from money. JFK Jr. They're all the same. You know, you're in the same unit as a guy who had a coal miner for parents, and you're treated the same. You know, daddy's money doesn't matter. So really, the army is by its very nature the most collectivist institution out there. Sameness is everywhere. So it's a bit odd that the left really seems to hate the military. Probably one of the most collectivist institutions out there. Now, the reason why theocracy works, whether it's the sort of medieval Catholic Church system with the monasteries and the cardinals, or an actual political system like the Jesuits in South America, or you could think of the Hutterites, but again, that's on a much smaller scale, not a national level. It can work because you're not working for profit. The motive for work is not even necessarily earthly reward. In a theocracy, the motivation for working is heavenly reward. So even if you don't get much in this life, and even if you're promised to eat a shit sandwich in this life, you'll eat it because you believe that you'll have a better reward in the next. And so a theocracy has this whole different motivation system that would motivate somebody to produce even if they're not being rewarded for it in this life now. So the collectivist problem of rewarding people for work and free riders. And furthermore, you don't want to be a free rider because God's going to send you to hell. And so, you know, if you take advantage of the collective theocracy, you have eternal hellfires to worry about. So the Jesuit experiment, by all standards, was largely a success. As I've read various authors who have no Catholic sympathies and no sympathy for the Jesuits, have praised it as one of the most successful collectivist experiments in history. And it's, by literal definition, a theocracy. It's the rule of the clergy. The Jesuits are a religious order that ruled over Paraguay for 150 years. And what's interesting, too, is on the political economy of theocracy, an essay written by Walter Noneman, he discusses the success of the Jesuit theocracy. And as far as incomes and standard of living, the Indians under the Jesuit tutelage had a very comparable standard to those living in Western Europe at the time. So it's not just a collectivism that sort of works on paper. It actually is competitive in some regards economically with old Europe, which is quite an accomplishment considering they're in the middle of the Amazon jungle dealing with illiterate, you know, half-naked Indians. So, but here's my proviso. Collectivism can theoretically work on the state level. And it can practically work at the state level, but it can do so only either as a military dictatorship or a theocracy. And to end with, I think the most famous example of a modern collectivist state is the Soviet Union. Now, that's essentially what it was. It was run by the army. So that's why, in part, Gorbachev's reforms were so difficult to ram through, because the army wasn't going to give up power easily. Stalin had given it a lot of power during the 30s and 40s to support his political position. And furthermore, it was a theocracy in the sense that the party played the role of a theocracy, the Communist Party. And this was an analogy made by both religious and secular critics going back to the 1930s, where the Kremlin was seen as Rome and Stalin was seen as the Pope. So it's not, you know, it was a widely accepted criticism at one point. So yeah, it's essentially a military caste system with a theocracy. So in that sense, collectivism can work. But it's very illiberal, it's anti-progressive, and it's not humanitarian or you know, sensitive to the concerns of you know, outcast individuals. So I'll start with Keith. Keith, what are some of your thoughts on the viability of collectivism as I've outlined?
Well, to expound a little bit on what you've said about the military essentially being the most egalitarian institution, and how a functioning collectivist society, other than a commune, a voluntary commune, would have to be either a military type of state or a theocracy. If we actually look at collectivist societies that have existed in the past and endured over a long period of time and been functional, most of them were actually a combination of a theocracy and a military state. Usually you have the two put together. In fact, in one of Ludwig von Mises' classic books. I think it may be in Socialism or maybe in one of the others. He actually talks about how there's never really been a collectivist or state that functioned as according to principles that anybody today would recognize as democratic. Virtually all functioning collectivist societies were dictatorships of some type. A good example is if you look at a lot of the ancient tyrannies. If you look at ancient Egypt and Rome and societies of that type, and then you compare them with modern tyrannies like Stalinism, National Socialism, the Juche idea in North Korea, all of that, Maoism, what you find is a great deal of similarity. You find that whether the ancient tyrannies or the modern collectivist states, in both instances, they tended to deify the leader as a godlike figure, either literally in the case of the ancient tyrannies or, in de facto sense as in the modern tyrannies. It's also true that these were all societies in the ancient world and in the modern world where the military was essentially the foundation of the society. It was, North Korea, for example, has an army first policy, as did National Socialist Germany, as did Maoist China, as did, as you mentioned, the Soviet Union. Also, the official ideology of the state, whatever it is, assumes the role of a theocracy. And in the ancient world, it was a literal theocracy. We worship the emperor as a sun god, or in Egypt, or they have the emperor cult of the emperor in Rome and places like that. And in the modern world, you have something similar, whether it's dictatorship or the proletariat or the superiority of the Aryan man or whatever. You have a political party, the Nazi Party, the Communist Party, that functions like the church. It sets its own dogma, it sets its own quasi-theology, and everyone is expected to conform to that. It's not up for vote, it's not up for dissent, and it's the individuals that are in charge with enforcing the dogma who have much of the power in the wider society, and dissent, heresy, or whatever is squelched. That was true in the ancient world. That was true in modern collectivist societies. It was also true in, to some degree, with medieval Catholicism. So any kind of collectivist society of this type that we're talking about has always had some combination of theocracy, either a literal one or secular de facto theocracy, and a heavy emphasis on militarism and a heavy emphasis on the worship and deification of the leadership. The reason that the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and today North Korea, the reason they suppress religion, traditional religion, so vociferously is because of this. They know that they cannot have a society like that and have competing centers of loyalty or where people worship something other than the state. It has to be the state that is supreme, and nothing else can take its place. Not the church, not God, not the family, not anything else. And this is a common theme you see throughout all historic societies of a strongly collectivist nature. Another interesting example, I think one of the most interesting examples from history, is the Hindu caste system. If you look at traditional India, what you see is that India was, modern India is a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, but traditional India was really, it was a combination of a theocracy and a military dictatorship. As far as the Hindu caste system, there are four basic castes. There's a lot of subcastes. There's thousands of subcastes, but the four basic castes are: you have the Brahmins at the top, who are considered to be the scholars and intellectuals, but they're really the priests. In these traditional cultures, it was always the priesthood that tended to dominate education and scholarly work and things like that. So the top class in the Hindu caste system were the Brahmins, the Hindu priests. And the next caste underneath that were the warrior caste, the military caste. And then everything else, the other two castes are the merchant and worker caste. And then you have all the subcaste people, the Dalits or untouchables and the indigenous people and all that. So traditional India was a combination military dictatorship and theocracy, where those two castes were the dominant caste. Everything else, business, labor, it was subordinated to that. Not only that, but within the structure of their society, it was a very immobile society. Everyone had a specifically assigned place in the social order according to whatever caste they belong to or whatever subcaste they belong to. And that was what they were expected to be. And it was also hereditary. If your father was a farmer, you were going to be a farmer. If your parents were beggars, then you would belong to the beggar class. They had a prostitute caste. They had all of that. So it's a very immobile society, but it's also a very a strong example of a very successful collectivist society. And another interesting modern example is Zionism. If we look at the early Zionist movement and we look at the early history of modern Israel, what we see is that you have these places called the kibbutzim, and a lot of Western socialists have admired those and say, well, the kibbutzim were great places. These are great successful communes. Now, nowadays, a lot of them have become commercialized and they're more like businesses and stuff like that. But in their earlier forms, they were like communes, but they were also very, the more successful ones tended to be either very religion oriented, that is oriented towards some kind of very orthodox Judaism, or they were very ethnocentric. It's all about the Jewish people as an ethnic group. So basically racialism. And interestingly, a lot of the highest ranking officers from the IDF, the Israeli military, the Israeli Defense Forces, have actually come from the kibbutzim. That's the sector of Israeli culture that they come from, because that's what they learned. They learned this kind of hardline commitment to Zionism as an ideal, and that translates into their zeal for military service and things like that because they come from this kind of collectivist background. And as you were talking about the military in a more general level in the draft, this idea has gone out of fashion today among leftists, because, and I think this is part of the legacy of the Vietnam War, because in the Vietnam War, the Western left more or less decided that the military is just a tool of the capitalist, of the fascist, of whomever. So military service became taboo, and then also the parallel to that, the modern Western left tends to be more individualistic. It's all about certainly compared to the older left, it's more about do your own thing individualism, and that's not conducive to military service either. But historically, a lot of people from the left have actually been in favor of the draft. They've actually been in favor of war because they view it as a means of furthering collectivism. The French revolutionaries, for example, the Jacobins, were among the first to create a modern collectivist state, and mass conscription and things of that nature. If you look, there are American progressives who will say, look, it was during times of war that the welfare state and things like that actually expanded to the greatest degree. World War I, that was the height of the progressive era. World War II and the New Deal, Harry Truman, the Korean War, the Fair Deal, Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War, the Great Society. And you do see that pattern. You do see that the welfare state tends to grow to the greatest degree at precisely the same time that the wars are going on and there's military conscription and things of that nature. And there have been plenty of far left collectivist type people who take it seriously, who take this idea seriously, who have said that, the draft, the military, that's egalitarian. And I used to know a guy, a Maoist. He was from France, but he was the real deal, hardline Maoist. And he said that the Maoist party in France that he belonged to was actually pro-draft for precisely this reason. It encourages collectivism. Plus the party members who were in the service, they learn how to fight, and so they need that for the revolution. To really take collectivism seriously, you do have to have a cultural foundation that is very oriented towards the collective. You have to have, the people have to be committed to either the religion or the political ideal, or whether it's communism or Zionism or National Socialism or something like that. You can't have individualistic collectivism. That just doesn't work.
Yeah. So Tim, what are some of your thoughts on what's been discussed and the viability of a collectivist system at the national level?
Well, first of all, I don't think any collectivist society could exist that is explicitly atheistic or individualistic. I don't think someone like Auguste Comte is actually really an atheist. He wanted to construct a church himself, his Church of Positivism. So in that regard, any of that, I actually don't think, in some sense, Trotsky is an atheist in any meaningful sense. His new religion is Maoism, or not for Trotsky. It is a religion of Leninism, of historical materialism. But the elephant in the room here is individualism, and I think you get the first case of individualism more precisely with Calvin, all the way back in the 1500s and 1600s in Northern Europe, Western Europe, which gets translated to England and then to the United States. And we see with the Calvinistic philosophy, it's the priesthood of all believers. There's no priest class. Everyone reads the Bible. Everyone can interpret the Bible. In this regard, Calvinism is actually very egalitarian and very individualistic. So I don't think it's any surprise that the United States, founded by people like Jonathan Edwards and so forth, the original Puritans, all the constitutional writers, all the revolutionaries, were individualistic to the core. I do not think any society that has. So one of the first things, I don't think any society with positive rights, as well as individualism, can exist. I think Keith's relatively famous on my part, my viewers listening, for saying rights don't exist in any meaningful sense. When we talk about modern America, people will bring up rights. They'll say right to health care, right to education, and you see this in the communes as well. But in the commune, you're not an individual. You're part of a larger group, and in this regard, I don't think individualism collectivism in the United States is plausible in any meaningful way in any near future. So that's really all I have to.
Okay. One interesting aspect about collectivism is the examples we give, the kind of striving for egalitarianism and sameness really does have an inevitable economic component to it. Because one of the almost obvious ways in which people demonstrate that they're different is by the level of wealth they have. And so if people are more wealthy than others, there's a whole different social circle, whole different consumption habits. Everything is different, and it's different. And of course, this is why historically these collectivist societies have had to so rigorously control economic action. So for example, Plutarch, when he describes Sparta and Lycurgus in his Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans, points out that they wanted iron money precisely because it would be considered useless by all the other Greeks in Hellas. So the Spartans couldn't go out and buy stuff from Athens and Corinth and could devote their time training for war. So in this context, accumulating wealth was an inhibition to war making. Whereas for someone like, say, the Jesuits, collecting wealth would be an inhibition to holiness because wealth gets between you and God. And for modern day leftists, wealth gets in the way of equality. I mean, the problem is, while the left will always say, we don't really mean this sort of crude one-to-one equality, but they really do, because it's the easiest way to measure equality. If everybody has the same house, the same car, the same food, just like in a barracks or a prison, it's very easy to determine who's equal or not. If it's some sort of intangible, because if you argue it's an intangible equality, well, then material inequalities don't matter, because it's just this intangible spiritual thing. But they're never satisfied with that. They're always trying to say, oh, he's too rich, he's too this. Well, okay, then you need to have material equality. And that's ultimately what all of these groups strive for, because that's the easiest way to measure inequality in material goods. And one of the ways that you do this is by limiting economic transaction. A lot of these, this is what Keith and I touched on this in our discussion about neo-reactionaries, as well as right ruminations, is that a lot of these neo-reactionary states, these reactionary states, had lots of price controls, lots of restrictions on economic action, because they believed correctly that unrestrained economic action was highly volatile. It really upset established norms, whatever those established norms happen to be. And so collectivism sort of, because it values conformity, unity, single-mindedness, market forces, which even Marx pointed out were inherently chaotic and disruptive, would be considered dangerous to the collectivist state. And I think one of the reasons why collectivist states tended to be more successful in the past, essentially pre-industrial, like say Sparta or the Jesuits, it's because economic action wasn't that important. Because ultimately the reason why economic action is so important today is it allows you to finance super weapons. Lasers, precision-guided missiles, robots, it would seem pretty soon. If you don't have money in industry, you can't do that, so you're pretty much screwed. But in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in the pre-industrial era, it was just, man-to-man, head-to-head. The Huns and the Romans had the same technology. In fact, the Huns probably had more advanced technology, even though they were a nomadic people without cities. So in that regard, Sparta's compromise of collectivism for war making worked out because things didn't change that much. And even the fact that they didn't have money wasn't that big of a deal, because even with money, Persia and Athens couldn't really build a better army. So it worked out for them in those contexts. The Jesuits had the protection of the Catholic Church. Nobody would touch them because the kings who attacked them would be excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Only after the Jesuit order was dissolved officially were they invaded and destroyed by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So in that case, what made them successful was that they didn't really have to compete against modern technological innovation. Now, the only modern example we have is the Soviet Union, and it failed badly. By the 1980s, NATO powers had a huge lead in computer technology, which gave them, advanced avionics for fly-by-wire technology, precision-guided munitions, and communications. And the Soviets were just going to eventually have a large conscript army that would just be completely outclassed by space-age NATO-US technology. And they collapsed before that inevitability happened due to internal contradictions, i.e. they can't feed themselves. And notice, religious collectivists have no problem feeding themselves. The monasteries, the Jesuits, the Hutterites, they could all export food. And Sparta, well, they had slaves, but they didn't have food shortages either. So I think the real problem today for a modern collectivist state, whether it's a military dictatorship like North Korea or a theocracy, would be how to maintain hard power viability. And hard power viability would be military technology, military weapon systems. The Soviets were the last ones who tried, and even they were only able to make it because, as was pointed out by Anthony Sutton with his trilogy on technical transfers, they only were able to survive because the West was constantly transferring technology to them. That's why they were always 1 or 2 steps behind, because they couldn't invent it on their own. They had to get it from the West. And so we see the libertarian capitalist argument on its face seems to make sense because we're living in an industrial society in which economic power is hard power. If you can't, make bullets and food for your soldiers, or you can't make missiles and rockets and robots, you're going to lose. And we've seen that time and again, the Confederacy versus the Union, the Nazis versus the Allies. Yeah. So that would be the real question. I think of all the collectivist experiments, a theocracy would be the most likely to solve that problem of innovation, because a military dictatorship of necessity has to rule by fear. A theocracy obviously can rule through fear as well, but it can also use the carrot, i.e. eternal rewards in the afterlife. And if they associate technological breakthroughs in hard work with rewards in the afterlife, then yeah, you could see a Jesuit-style collectivist theocracy inventing lasers. I don't think that's impossible on paper. It may not be likely. But I think in the future, given that how warfare has changed due to industrial commercial warfare, a sort of religious theocratic collectivist society has the best resources available to solve that problem of being relevant in the hard power department. Because ultimately, yeah.
Can I butt in here for a second?
Yeah, sure.
The biggest problem with these religious theocracies, I think, in the current world is, and this is probably not true in the past, is no one believes, with a capital B, in the belief systems that used to mobilize the religious theocracies. So, I mean, before 1900, and I don't think you can entirely blame this on Darwin or any one person or Nietzsche, but no one believes in religious theocracies. Even ISIS, to a large extent, if you gave ISIS economic opportunities, it's highly likely that most people who are join ISIS might not join ISIS anymore. And to the same extent with the alt-right, if you gave many of the alt-right supporters economic opportunities, there any desire for a secular fascist theocracy of some, not fascist type government like that, would probably fall away. So in this regard, reform liberalism probably in the end will co-opt them and bring them around. But back to the belief, I don't really see a large movement of fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Catholics, fundamentalist Muslims, fundamentalist Hindus, or where have you, in any time in the coming years. We can't just download or delete Darwin or delete Nietzsche or delete any of these characters from the collective humanity. Now, maybe in some sort of apocalyptic realm, we get hit by a comet and everyone, 99% of people die, or climate change or something like that, then we could reconstruct a religious theocracy. But I mean, why join a religious theocracy? I mean, most religions, except maybe certain Islam, are fairly sexually conservative, especially Christianity. It has all sorts of prohibitions. Jewish religions have all sorts of prohibitions. And maybe in some of the upper classes of some other religions you get benefits. But no one believes in any of these systems that could happen. So if you want to take the Jesuits in Latin America, why did that end? Well, the Spanish came in. But then again, they eventually set up a republic. And I'm not sure whether or not the republic did better than the Jesuits. So that would be my question. So if you can't get the belief in these religious theocracies, then how would you have these religious theocracies, Todd?
No, that's a perfectly valid point. I'm not really discussing the problem of how to get people to believe. I'm discussing the problem in that the lesson of the 1980s is that when it comes to exercising hard power, due to the rapid growth of technological innovation, a collectivist society will fall behind, like the Soviet Union did. And any future collectivist society, even if it was implemented, would likely it would be a large armed forces, like say North Korea, with ancient technology that's barely viable today. So, that's just, barely limping along at this point. I was more asking the question, if we were to conceive of a viable modern collectivist society that could answer the question of maintaining parity with the West and hard power, I think something like a Jesuit experiment might work. How will we get there? I have no idea. I'm only interested in answering this question. So I guess, first of all, Keith, what do you think? Do you think that of all the options for a collectivist society to keep pace with innovation, I think a theocratic one could work? I mean, look at the innovations of the Catholic Church, right? Even the Big Bang Theory was pioneered by a Catholic priest.
Well, the interesting thing about that is this gets back to what Tim was saying earlier about American culture being individualistic, and he points to the Protestant roots of that. If we go back and trace the history of Western individualism and how it developed, and clearly the Western world is more individualistic than everywhere else, I think that goes without saying. You can go back and see several different points in history that on which that kind of cultural, I guess you could say, cultural foundation is built. To some degree, it starts with the culture of ancient Athens and the Socratic method and that kind of thing. But then also with the rise of Christianity in ancient Rome, Christianity is more individualistic than pagan religions typically were. In the pagan traditional religions, they weren't what our modern pagans think they are. They were they were very static systems. I mean, they were very hierarchical. They were very rigid. You had, in most of those traditional pagan societies, you had a certain place in the social order, and that's where you stayed. And who you were, your worth as a person was dependent on that. It was dependent on whether you were nobility or a slave or a servant or a soldier or something like that. That was certainly true in Rome. That was true in India, as I mentioned earlier. And most of the traditional pagan societies were like that. What was one of the things that was unique about Christianity was that it was universalistic. Anybody could be a Christian. You could be a slave and be a Christian. You could be a nobleman. You could be a soldier. You could be a woman. And all these other status differentials didn't matter. And not only that, you didn't have to belong to a particular ethnic group or nationality. You could be a Jew or a Gentile or whatever. So that's very individualistic compared to what traditional pagan religions were typically like. And then with Protestantism, that comes much later, you have an even more individualistic religion that emerges, because you're cutting out the priest of the church as the middleman. And now, as Tim said, it's priesthood of all believers. So, by extension, you have a proliferation of an infinite number of Protestant churches. And then after that, you start to see the emergence of the scientific revolution, and then the Enlightenment, and then classical liberal philosophy, and then out of that, the American and French revolutions, and the West, the whole tradition of Western individualism that comes out of that. You don't find any cultural parallels to that in anywhere else, not in Asia or Africa or even places like Russia and all of that are technically Western societies. You don't find that. So American culture is very individualistic in particular, because it's the most radical, extreme version of traditional Western individualism. It takes Protestant individualism and Enlightenment individualism and amps it up on steroids. And that's why socialism and communism and fascism and things like that have never had anything like the influence in America that they've had in many other places. Like today, when we hear people say Trump is a fascist or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a Bolshevik, that's laughable by world historical standards. People who are actually familiar with those ideologies and or even believe in those ideologies wouldn't take any of that seriously. And the people I know who are actual fascists don't think Trump is one of them. The people I know who are actual Bolsheviks don't think that AOC is one of them. So I think that's why I think Tim is right, an American style collectivism wouldn't ever be. If socialism in America would be like some kind of cooperative individualism, like Benjamin Tucker or something like that, it wouldn't be collectivist socialism proper. But as for the problem of innovation, I think that Catholicism was able to innovate because, to a greater degree than some of these other systems, because it was sort of a halfway point between traditional collectivism on one hand and modern, liberal individualism on the other hand. Catholicism is sort of the period in history in which Catholicism was the dominant paradigm, which was quite some time. It was about 1,500 years, 1,200 years, something like that. It was sort of straddling the fence between actual collectivism, the kind of collectivist societies that you have in the ancient world and that reemerge in the modern world in certain situations. It was a halfway point between that and between modern Western individualism. So because it kind of had a foot in each door, I think it was able to innovate in a way that certain other kinds of collectivist systems could not. Now, Tim also raised the interesting example of the Islamists like ISIS. One thing that I think is really interesting about some of these really extreme Islamist terrorist type of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and groups like that is actually how adaptable they are to their circumstances. On one hand, they have this philosophy that most people look at and say, well, that's like something out of the 8th century or something. But it's interesting how they're able to utilize technology and adapt it to their own purposes. They're able to, in terms of communications and munitions and all kinds of things. I mean, they have no problem with taking the tools of the modern world and adapting it to this very medieval type of philosophy they have. And I think that gets back to what I was saying earlier. That's because of the fact that they actually, and this is back to Tim's point as well about believers with a capital B. Those people believe in what they do. The Islamists are true believers. Like the Jesuits or like the Crusaders or something like that. They're all about that. But at the same time, even though they may have this very collectivist philosophy, they're so committed to their ideas that they will use any tools they can find as a means of trying to advance their ideas. And in that sense, I think in the future of the world, I think that if there's ever going to be any kind of mass collectivist society in the future, I don't know how probable this is, but if there is going to be something like that, it's not going to be something like National Socialism or Bolshevism or this 20th century models of secular utopias or dystopias or whatever. I think it would probably be something like Islamism. It would be something like, ISIS actually getting their caliphate or Al Qaeda, because that's their vision. That's what they claim they want. They want a global caliphate, or at least a caliphate that includes all Muslims or something like that. So it's kind of like a collectivist Islamist empire is really their goal. I don't think they're going to achieve that. But if we did have a kind of collectivist society of the time we're talking about in the future, I do think that's probably what it would be. It would probably be them that actually brings it about.
Tim, do you have anything to add to that? Any comments?
I think one of the successes of individualism in general is it emancipates the individual. So one of the questions I think Thad Russell was on Douglas Lane or Ben Burgess, one of these Zero Books characters, was on Thad Russell's podcast. And Thad Russell is sort of like a libertarian taken to the extreme. And Thad Russell basically asked point blank, why would I work in your society? And why I just want to smoke weed all day. I just want to smoke weed, jerk off. Why would I work at all in your society? I mean, you'd have to just force me to work. And you're the ones who complain about South Africa and Palestine. I mean, you'd have to set up a similar regime. And Noam Chomsky basically admits this about the Soviet Union. They emancipated it. And actually, Thad Russell wrote, I'd say, two of the most interesting chapters ever: The Freedom of Slavery and Slavery of Freedom. So one of the interesting things about American individualism, which I would say is Calvinistic, I think the primary group that Weber was analyzing was Calvinists. He was analyzing Anabaptists, but to a certain extent, I think Anabaptists and Methodists of the time were as if Calvinists. They believed in a pretty scary God. I would consider this you, Todd. That they feared it. Knowledge begins with fearing the God. And same with ISIS, a different religion. They fear and love and adore, so forth, Allah and so forth. So I just don't see how this sort of communistic collectivism can work at all without constructing either some sort of scary state, which most people on the left at least say they don't want to do. Douglas Lane, Sam Cedar, they always criticize, the surveillance state, the managerial state, the evil bosses and so forth. But how do you get people to work? And if you don't get people to work, especially if you believe that labor is the root of value, you're not like, or unless, which is the Marxist claim, they believe that labor is the root of value. Why would you work? I mean, if you can get everything you want without working, now maybe this could come about by AI, but I don't think AI is coming to save us or kill us either. I think AI is sort of laughable largely. So I just, back to Thad Russell's question, I don't know why anyone would work if they got free health care, free housing, free drugs, free sex.
What did Ben Burgess say?
Why work at all?
Well, what was Ben Burgess's response?
He didn't really give a response. Now, he said that he wouldn't force him to go to his meetings and force him to work. But I don't think they're even aware of those questions. So so like market forces carry so much freight in our society that, see, I actually think people like Douglas Lane themselves are just, they're basically capitalists who advocate another system, which would just be a new reform capitalism. I really think that a lot of these Zero Books characters and a lot of Marxists today are just reform capitalists. So he didn't really answer the question, which is very frustrating for me, but I don't really know why you'd work in a society where you got a bunch of positive rights, which, again, which is why you get innovation in capitalist individualist societies. You work to get more profit. You work to get more done, more widgets produced in an hour. You work to get more whatever done. And then you can do it for a variety of reasons. You could do it for sex. You could do it for money. You could do it for God. And that's actually one of the geniuses of capitalism, or classical liberal capitalism, is it can, it's such a big tent, it can co-opt so many different groups, from Muslims to Greek Orthodox and even Catholics and all sorts of groups that can get work under this large tent. So, but he never really answered the question.
To answer the question, there's really only two ways. Slavery, like Sparta did, and Thomas More's Utopia, the slaves work, and the elite who enjoy the fruits of communism don't. They might go to war, and that's how they have fun. That's their sporting event, going to war. Or you use religious motivations. So, for example, again, as I've mentioned with the Jesuits in South America, and to a lesser extent the Hutterites in northwestern Canada and the United States, they have essentially a collectivist mode of production. But it was very efficient. So the Jesuits, their production level and standard of living for the indigenous population was compared favorably to those in Europe. And the Hutterites are very efficient.
But one question. Both of these examples, again, I don't see working in modern America because they're very sexually conservative, the Jesuits and the Hutterites. And they're capital B believers, or at least the elites were capital B believers. And enough people in the societies themselves were capital B believers in the system. They didn't shirk so to speak, in work. And actually many people on the left like when strikes happen and, are actively rooting for strikes, actively rooting for all this stuff. And Zizek makes a joke himself about like, oh, now the workers are in charge, so you have to go back to work. So so these are very conservative. The Jesuits and Hutterites are extremely conservative. I think, and Keith had a Facebook post, which I was overreading, had about 200 comments. And, I think one person made the comment that when leftists get control, they tend to become tyrannical or they become conservative. And McIntyre makes the same point in his chapter, in his book, I think it's chapter 12 of After Virtue. Makes the same point that when they actually get in charge and the system doesn't work, they either have to go back to the old system or they have to invent some new system.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, again, I'm not talking about how we get there, but if that's an objection going to be raised, then slavery. The state will force you to work. And that's why the Soviet Union was that way. They couldn't appeal to anybody's religious sensibilities since they destroyed those. They couldn't appeal to anybody's sense of honor, right? If you associate honor with working and shame with begging, then an honor-shame society might be able to encourage work without profit or the stick. But again, all that was just washed away by the Soviets, so they had to rely on slavery. So what were some of your thoughts on this, Keith?
Well, when it comes to what Tim was saying about things like capitalism versus socialism and are modern Marxists really Marxists at all, I would say no, they're not. Most of what gets passed off as socialism or even Marxism today has nothing to do with what classical socialists or classical Marxists actually believe. As far as the issue of incentives to work, somebody that really took the Marxist philosophy seriously would say that that's not really an issue because it's based on what they consider to be a misconception about human nature. One argument that critics of socialism have often used is that, well, it goes against human nature because aren't people going to, not work if they don't have to, or whatever. But the Marxists believe, the ones who really take this seriously, and this idea is based on older thinkers that predate Marx. But the idea is that human nature is shaped by social conditions. So in a competitive, acquisitive, or property and status-based society, yes, of course, people are going to be acquisitive and selfish or competitive. But in a society that's based on collectivism or communism or socialism, well, then human nature is going to be changed by the change in social conditions. So people are going to want to work because they want to contribute to the common good, because they're not going to be selfish anymore. They're going to be committed. They're going to have a changed nature. They're going to be redeemed or regenerated or something like that. That's what the actual, a lot of classical 19th century, and it predates this, socialist thinking would say in response to that the motive to work under collectivism is social. It's not personal. And in fact, one of the reasons why the collectivist states of the type we're talking about, like the Soviet Union, they were actually very authoritarian when it came. Well, obviously they were authoritarian in a lot of ways, but they were also very authoritarian when it came to the issue of obligations to work. There was no such thing as being a shirker in some of those systems. In fact, in the Soviet Union, they had what they called the parasite law, which basically meant that being unemployed was against the law, because they said, look, we have a collectivist society with full employment. Everybody has a right to a job. If you don't have a job, you're just being a parasite. So that means you can just go to jail. That was and the other communist, Marxist-Leninist, whatever states, all have had policies like that at all. In fact, and it's not just unique to the state. If you go back and you look at what a lot of the 19th century socialists said about work obligations, a lot of them would actually quote the passages in the New Testament. It's in one of the, I forget which one, but it's in one of the Pauline epistles, where the St. Paul says, well, he who does not work does not eat. Well, they would actually quote that. In fact, I remember reading an old anarchist pamphlet from the 19th century.
Lenin did.
Yeah, it was I remember reading an old anarchist pamphlet from the 19th century by a Russian anarchist who said that, who quoted that. He says, in the anarchist communist society, he who does not work does not eat. So there was no such thing as welfare parasitism in these systems. These old 19th century and early 20th century socialists, their idea was, no, yes, you have a changed human nature because you're in a collective society. So you're no longer selfish. You're motivated to work for the common good. But when societies like that were actually created, they said, okay, in order to mold people in this particular direction, where they have this changed human nature, where they're going to work for the common good, we can't just allow people to be parasites. So we're going to have laws against that, and we're going to enforce them. And that's how those kinds of systems actually worked. There was no such thing as this idea of entitlements. They didn't. I mean, you had in some of those systems, you had the state guaranteed right to health care, whatever quality health care they had, or what education and housing. But that was considered to be relative to duties. You also have the duty to the state to work, to be a good patriotic communist or whatever they were. And it was just like what we were saying earlier about the military. In the military, you get housing, health care, food, and all that. But not just to do your own thing. Along with that is this long list of duties and obligations and responsibilities that go along with that. So it's based on your status as a member of the military, or the kind of collectivist societies we're talking about, as a member of the state, as a citizen of the state. You get these so-called rights to all this stuff, but along with it is just as many responsibilities and obligations, but usually a whole lot more. So that's actual collectivism. Like Mao Zedong, for example, when he talked about human nature, he said that there was proletarian human nature and there was bourgeois human nature. And what he basically meant is that, as I was saying earlier, it's the idea that the human personality is the product of the social environment. So if you change the social environment, you're essentially creating a new species, or at least you're creating a whole new variations of the human personality. And these old socialists took this stuff very seriously. Modern socialists don't. Modern socialists, like I think Tim mentioned Sam Cedar and something like that. I mean, the idea that these guys are socialists is a joke. I mean, these guys are just liberals. I mean, they are, but if you actually look at what Marx said about capitalism, Marx actually praised capitalism immensely because he said it had the effect of breaking down traditional collective societies like feudalism. He said, look, the bourgeoisie is the most revolutionary class in history. They've done so much to destroy the old order. They got rid of noblesse oblige. They got rid of feudalism. They got rid of the peasantry. They got rid of all of that. And if you actually look at the trajectory that capitalism has followed historically, the capitalism has always been very accommodating to cultural leftism, the kind of left wing that comes out of there are older prototypes to it, but it really becomes dominant on the left in the 60s, this kind of do your own thing individualism. I mean, one of the first things capitalism did in the 60s was they tried to take the counterculture and commercialize it, where you had, designer, capitalist hippie clothes and that kind of stuff. And they've done the same thing with all of the social liberalism that's come out of that time. What about gay rights? That's a perfect example. Right? Gay rights starts off as this fringe countercultural thing. And in half a century now, you've got all the major corporations putting up rainbow flags and celebrating Pride Month and, diversity policies and all this kind of stuff. So that's the actual impact of capitalism when it comes to traditional cultures, which is why authentic traditionalists don't like it. I even wrote a whole book on that. I wrote a book called Thinkers Against Modernity. And a lot of that is about thinkers that criticize modern societies for this reason, because they did, capitalism and liberalism and all these things did break down all these traditional orders. And that's why a lot of these people were opposed to it. They thought it was, it had the effect. I mean, they opposed it for a wide range of reasons, but a common reason was either it broke down traditional hierarchical orders, or it lowered the superior people to the level of the common people and things like that. That's the standard Nietzschean type of critique of modernity. In fact, I even heard a talk once by a philosopher who named what was his name? Something Ryman, who was certainly a leftist, but he actually made an argument where he called it the Marxist case for capitalism. And he said that, I'm a Marxist. I believe in egalitarianism and, equality and all that. But capitalism is how you get that, because capitalism, makes all this prosperity possible where everybody can just live a cushy life and not be as dependent on institutions and authority and stuff like that. And capitalism breaks down traditional social structures, whether it's, the older conceptions of the family and national borders and all these kinds of things. So collectivism and a type of conservatism or type of traditionalism tend to blend into one another. The most of the Marxist-Leninist states, after the first generation or so, or even sooner, became essentially national conservative states. I mean, they believed in the same things that Western's type, reactionaries or whatever believe in. It's all about, well, except for the religion part, but take the religion out of it. It's all about, family, flag, and state and empire and army and and all of that kind of stuff. Blue lives matter, support the troops, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's what actual national communism looked like.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time, so I'll start with you, Tim. I'll give for your final statement.
I don't think any collectivist society is going to emerge in the United States unless you get some sort of global some sort of cataclysm. I don't see any reason why it would form. I don't see any reason why anybody would want it. There seems to be two things that are a requirement. Either you're going to reconstruct the religious epistemology, or you got to have a new man, like a sort of a new, emancipate man, as Keith was talking about, how you have to have a man who is human nature in a proletariat versus bourgeois man. So you need to have a, you need that, and I don't see how you get to there, and whether that's a problem with collectivism. I mean, if you can't have those two factors, one of those two things, I don't see any reason why anyone would work or anyone would want this. So those are my two statements.
Okay, Keith, what are your final statements?
Well, I agree with Tim in the sense that I think that America is the last society where you would have that kind of collectivism put into place. The American culture is very much about, it deifies the idea of acquisitiveness and status based on material consumption and material possessions. And now a lot of people say, yeah, but that's just the traditional culture. And with immigration and all that, that's going to change. They're going to bring their whatever values with them. And I don't really think that's the case. I think I see most immigrant communities very much assimilating into at least that aspect of American culture. The idea of, we want to go to America to make money and get rich. Most immigrants that I've known personally, that's why they came here. American money is valuable and they want some of it. So, yeah, in fact, I do think, though, that there's a guy who posts on a lot of my social media forums, a guy named Dick Moore, and he actually raised an interesting argument once that he argues that super capitalism could potentially generate a type of collectivism, in the sense that the more wealth a society has, the more people can afford to just, pursue all kinds of indulgences, like, be a drug addict if you want, or be an extreme sexual libertine because you got plenty of money to cover your, penicillin shots, or you can belong to some weird, fringe cult or something like that. So it's possible that a super capitalism, a very wealth society, could produce enough prosperity that people could pursue these whatever kind of libertine indulgences, including living collectively if they wanted. So I suppose there's that would be a somewhat paradoxical way to look at it.
All right. Well, thanks again, Keith and Tim, for coming up. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.